Hirsch Goldberg Pollen was an American citizen and an Israeli citizen who was severely wounded and during the 10/7 pogrom in Israel. And he was kidnapped by the Hamas terrorists that day. He was brutally wounded and he was tortured and starved in his captivity. He was murdered at the end of August 2024. He had endured barbaric cruelty. He had been starved. He was the face of the hostages for many Americans, and his parents, John and Rachel, join me today. John, I'm honored to meet you. Rachel, I wish I was talking to you again for the second time in other than a time of mourning for you, but I thank you both for coming out to speak about the hostages who remain, who include at least 2 Americans who are alive. There are 76 hostages, either living or dead, in Israel. I saw your message yesterday, and I think President Trump saw it too. John, let me begin with you. What did you make of the president's ultimatum to Hamas yesterday after you two put your message out?
Well, first of all, we again thank President Trump and Mr. Witkoff because things had been stuck, totally stuck for something like 450 days. And they went to work quickly, and whatever it is that they did, they worked their deal making prowess and pulled out the cork that had everything stuck. So thank you, first of all, for getting things moving. In terms of the message, we appreciate very much President Trump pushing parties in the region hard to accelerate the deal. We saw on Saturday, we learned 165 days ago of the conditions when Hirsch, who's 6 feet tall, came out dead, bullet-ridden at 115 pounds, and the other 5 taken out with him, all dead, were also all skeletal. So it's not new news, but the world got to see the condition of the hostages. And our point, and what we're really hoping Mr. President Trump will do, is accelerate this negotiated settlement. It's working, it's getting people out, and our plea is make it happen faster. There are 76 hostages left. Let's get them all out this weekend. And you mentioned at least 2 living Americans. There are 6 Americans still being held. So we just want to implore everybody to keep this deal on track, but accelerate it.
Rachel, the president did give an ultimatum yesterday. How did you react to that ultimatum? Because it looks to me, and I'm not an Israeli, I try and follow it, that the IDF is mobilizing in anticipation of Hamas saying no and not releasing 76 on Saturday.
Well, it's always hard to read in this region what is sort of hedging bets and being reactive and being theatrical and what is real. And we very much were played with during our 330 days of excruciating torment while we knew Hirsch was being held. And I think that both sides are so skittish right now. And that's why we are imploring both sides, stay the course. This deal that President Trump and Mr. Witkoff have been able to get going is working. It's simply a question of it is taking too much time for everyone, I might add, not just for the hostages who still, by the way, are representing dozens of nationalities, and they are Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims being held still. But we also have to remember there are innocent Gazan people who are suffering. So both sides are suffering terribly, and it doesn't benefit the peoples on both sides for this to take such a long, extended period of time to implement.
Rachel, I want to stay with you for 2 comments and then go back to John. More than 400 IDF soldiers have died since 10/8. Many were murdered on 10/7 as well, but more than 400 have died in Gaza since 10/8. A resumption of the war means even more will die. So it is not something to be said lightly or for an American to say, do this, do that. I have no opinion on what happened. I want Israel to do what Israel wants to do. But I am surprised that very few people seem to know that they were shocked on Saturday. I think the reason is because we saw Gadi Moses come out, an 80-year-old man, and look like he had survived as well as anyone could have survived. But then the 3 hostages who were released on Saturday shocked us. But as you just mentioned, we ought not to have been shocked, correct?
Oh, I don't think that we should be shocked that the hostages are being tortured and starved. We now know from people who were in the war cabinet and in the defense echelon, who are saying, we knew then, we knew a year ago, the conditions, especially for certain hostages, is completely torturous. Starvation, being burned, being shackled, being held up by their feet, being gagged and bound, having no light, no sunlight in almost 500 days, some of them. Sometimes they go days without eating. Orlevy said on Saturday when he came home, he hadn't been bathed in months. This is not acceptable.
John, Ruthie Bloom was on the Commentary podcast this morning saying that in light of the President Trump's ultimatum, if they release 20 as opposed to 3, there's going to be a dilemma. I'm trying to anticipate various scenarios. What would your reaction be to that?
So I'm not sure what that means, release 20. I'm not hearing that is even a possibility. Although, again, in the world where we want to accelerate things, let me put some perspective around the numbers for a second. There were
Please.
251 hostages taken on October 7th. So roughly, in almost 500 days, 160 have been released in a variation of a negotiated settlement. 8 have been rescued through military operations. So when my focus is on getting out all of the remaining hostages, that's how I'm thinking about it. For the hostages to go back to war now, which is being threatened, would be devastating, let alone what Rachel said about the rest of the region. So if getting out 20 this weekend instead of 3 is some way to show that we're accelerating the releases, obviously, I'm in favor. I don't know if you're talking about the conundrum of 20 and then for some reason things get stuck afterwards. But
Ruthie threw out 20 as being a midpoint between what they were supposed to do, what they had agreed to do, 3, and they've already breached the agreement in many different ways. But they were supposed to do 3 on Saturday, and the president says all or nothing now, so maybe they do a halfway point. Ruthie, by the way, I admire both of yours courage incredibly, because what you're doing in the middle of mourning Hirsch is advocating for the other prisoners. And I'm sure my audience agrees with me that incredibly noble and inspiring, but hard. Last week, again from the Commentary podcast this morning, the Hamas leadership flew to Iran to meet with the supreme leader of that theocracy. And we don't know what was said there, but it seems clear to me Iran is pulling at least most of the strings on Hamas. Should any retribution for any failure to apply to the deal be applied at Iran or at the people of Gaza, Ruthie?
So, I mean, we've talked for 494 days about kind of follow the flow of the funds that's funding Hamas and that's giving them their guidance. And it's the country you talked about. Rachel and I have always said we are not strategists in the political realm. We're not politicians. So we've stayed out of suggesting any kind of policy decisions for Israel, for the US, or any of the mediators. We're here not just as people who are emotionally invested, but who have paid the heaviest price, as you mentioned, Hugh. And that's why we are still in it. We know what it feels like. We know what it is to be the victims of global diplomatic failure, I'll call it. The world let us down and so many of the other hostage families. We don't want any other families to go through that. In terms of how it's ultimately going to shake out in the region with Iran or any other proxy sponsors, I'm hopeful that there are political leaders who are going to figure that out, but that they're only going to prioritize that after we save all the lives that we can save right now that are so precarious.
Okay, I want to pause my interview there. Rachel and John stayed with me about another 7 or 8 minutes. I'm going to talk to Noah Rothman and play the conclusion of that interview for you. And you want to stay tuned to it. In the meantime, while I was talking to John and Rachel Goldberg, Prime Minister Netanyahu released a video saying we're with Donald Trump. The war resumes on Saturday at noon, which would be, I believe, 7 p.m. in Israel, Saturday noon, United States time, unless all the hostages are released. There has also been another hostage released today. Mark Fogel is out. Steve Witkoff went over to Russia. Putin made a good faith gesture, which I think is a good sign for maybe beginning negotiations over the Ukraine-Russia war and getting Russia to pull its troops back out of their illegal invasion of Ukraine. I think that's a good sign that Putin wants to talk. The audio and transcript of my interview with John Poland and Rachel Goldberg Poland is now posted at hughhewitt.com. I'll play the conclusion of that interview after I talk with my next guest, Noah Rothman, who is the senior political writer at National Review. Hello, Noah. How are you?
Hi, Hugh. I'm great. How are you doing?
Good. I listened to the editors today on my drive to the studio, and I'm going to let you expand on it. But Caitlin Collins last night said on CNN, we're 3 weeks into the Trump administration, and we are dangerously close to many say that we are dangerously close to a constitutional crisis. To which I responded, this is ridiculous. I've been teaching constitutional law for 27 years. Arguably, the last time we were close to a constitutional crisis was the court packing plan in 1937, but that didn't go anywhere. And the actual last constitutional crisis we had was the Civil War. I think you guys gave way too much credit to the idea of there being a constitutional crisis today.
You have a high bar, though, to establish constitutional crises.
It is either
usurpation of Article 3 or Civil War.
No,
that's a high bar.
It's when it doesn't work. It's when, and it's still working. Nothing is not working. It worked on 1/6. It worked on 9/11. It works. It's very strong.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. We could argue semantics. I think your definition approaches closer to a constitutional calamity than a crisis. A crisis implies resolution is possible. A desirable resolution is possible. And I do think if the president were flagrantly violating court orders, and a court enjoined as something that the president did, and he just said, dare you to enforce it.
Andrew Jackson, the court has made its order, let them enforce it. That was a constitutional crisis.
Yeah. I mean, but we're not there yet.
No, we're not even close.
Many are saying.
Based on the 4 years of Trump, based on the first 4 years, did he ever trigger a constitutional crisis?
No. And a lot of the people who are defending, and I was listening to a CNN panel yesterday evening, where Scott Jennings was entertaining the notion that because these the court when they enjoined these orders, and then some of them are usurping authority, according to him. And I think there's an arguable case to be made there for some, maybe not for others. But they're instituting the constitutional crisis, and to observe that order would be itself the constitutional crisis. I think we're all just talking ourselves in circles here. Joe Biden, when he said, I'm going to disobey the Supreme Court on student loans, watch me do it, he didn't really do it. He just wanted people to think they were doing it. J.D. Vance and the Trump administration aren't ignoring the court orders that are putting a halt to some of the things they want to do temporarily while other courts review it. They want people to think they are, which I think is its own level of impropriety.
I think what J.D. Vance, the vice president, posted is, you may not do this. We'll see you in court. He didn't say that we'll see you in court, but it's all being litigated in a rather routine fashion.
And if J.D. Vance were to say, we'll see you in court without giving a single inch of their argument to their opponents, but merely saying we will prevail in the court of law, there wouldn't be a single thing to say about it. They do, however, and both Democrats and Republicans do this nowadays, they do, however, want to project a level of zeal for their political cause that will be undeterred by the fundaments of rule of law in this country. Little obstacles like a judge's decision will not deter us from
I want to push back on that.
I think that's... All right.
Hamilton in Federalist 70s.
I think there's impropriety there.
Hamilton in Federalist 70s said, energy in the executive is the hallmark of every successful regime. Hamilton in 78 says there's obviously judicial review. And Marbury v. Madison sets it up. We have a system. It works. District courts shouldn't be issuing national injunctions like popcorn at a theater, but they are. And the Supreme Court's going to get to this. And the Roberts Court, Trump built the trampoline. Now he's jumping on it. He built circuits that will divide. Now he's jumping up. I just think it's ridiculous to alarm people about a constitutional crisis when it's not even, we're not even remotely close to the real deal.
There's quite a lot that the administration wants to test at the Supreme Court level that I'm eager to see resolved. The constitutionality of inspectors general, as you say, previously, also the Impoundment Act and the ability of the president to reserve funds that are appropriated by Congress. I think the Supreme Court has a lot of things to clear up. The question is whether the administration is crafting quote unquote test cases that will redound to its benefit when they're reviewed by the appellate courts and possibly the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court decides to take it up. There's an analysis by Jack Goldsmith and a co-author that suggests he's unimpressed by the degree to which the administration has tried to prep the battle space for a successful challenge to some of these restrictions on Article 2's authority.
You read Jack
I'm not an
Goldsmith's
expert
biography, by the way? He wrote an autobiography
not.
about his dad, his stepdad being fingered as the Hoffa murderer. It's fascinating. It's one of the most interesting books I've ever read.
I have read
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've not read the book, but I did hear that bizarre connection.
It's
Nevertheless, I defer to Mr. Goldsmith.
He's a brilliant man. I'll go read that. Let me ask you about this. I think Donald Trump issued the order on birthright citizenship in order to have a test case because he doesn't believe it's going to work. I don't believe it's going to work. I don't want it to work. I think birthright citizenship was the practice of the United States from 1868 forward when the 14th Amendment was passed. And I don't care what a couple of senators said on the floor because it's the plain reading of the statute. But I'm sure they want to close that book, right, Noah? Don't they just want to close the book?
Maybe. I mean, I'm sure there are ideologues within the administration who believe that this is neither essential to the American character nor properly read, and judicial precedent around it is more expansive than it was properly understood in 1868 when it was ratified by the states. I think there are true believers within the administration's firmament. There are probably others who just want to get this question answered and behind them. There's a political risk involved here insofar as these priorities, these legal priorities, while really important to the conservative legal movement, are a bit boutique for the rest of the country. And they elect this president to become very serious about immigration and get consumer prices down. And to the extent that they don't see the president focusing on consumer prices, that's a warning sign. We saw that in the CBS News poll over the weekend.
Now, Andy McCarthy argues he wants the Impoundment and Budget Control tested. I want the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978 tested because the Article 2 power has been greatly truncated by statutory encroachments for 200 years. And it's time to figure out what the president can do. I want to give you the last minute, Noah. Do you expect the pace of challenges to slacken after this initial flurry of month-long series of EOs?
I think I do, but I'm deferring to Yuval Levin's logic on that, which makes perfect sense to me. Every new administration comes in with a head full of steam, resolved to do as much as quickly as possible with a lot of plans, and all of them get exhausted pretty quickly. And those avenues having been fully explored, they end up encountering a lethargic or resistant Congress, or political obstacles in the culture and the zeitgeist, or the courts who slow things down. So yes, I anticipate we're going to see the pace
That's it. Start as fast, go as far and as fast as you can, but expect to decelerate because that's the law of physics, political physics. Noah C. Rothman on X, thank you. Go listen to the Editors, America, because the Editors today was all about this. It was a fascinating edition of the Editors, their podcast. An hour ago, I sat down with John Poland and Rachel Goldberg Poland, the parents of Hirsch Goldberg Poland, murdered by Hamas in the tunnels after nearly a year of captivity, torture, and starvation, and severe wounding when the pogrom on 10/7 occurred. Here's the conclusion of my interview with John and Rachel.
We should also remind your listeners that we still have our youngest hostages, and they're hostages. They're not criminals. They're not prisoners. The two youngest are a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old. I mean, this is not acceptable in any way, shape, or form. And we have elderly hostages that have not been released yet, who are over 80 years old. I don't understand, where is the world? Where is the outrage? And as John mentioned, we still have 6 Americans being held, 2 that we know are alive, and 4 that we aren't 100% sure, but are assumed dead.
Yeah, Segui Dekel Chen is one of the 2 Americans we know for sure, or we think for sure is alive. His 3rd child was born during his hostage captivity. Rachel, the agony that you've gone through and that John have gone through and your family's gone through, how do you talk to the hostage families about that and about keeping hope alive even when you were so deeply wounded by hope not being delivered on?
I really, we are people of faith, and I actually say thank God I believe in God, because we have had the ultimate blow, and in such a unique and shattering way, that it's hard to relate to people. But we were, for such a long period, part of the hostage family cohort who still had our loved one alive there. And we feel so connected to that community. And that's why we continue on this advocacy, plight, because we can't rest, and we can't actually continue forward until these people are home. We feel like the truck is still on us. It's moved, because it used to be on our chest. Now we're still pinned under it, but it's our leg.
I remember you used that analogy in our first conversation. I've never forgotten that. John, let me close this way. I'm very confident that National Security Advisor Walls and probably the president will see this video and hear this interview. Very, very confident. What do you want to say to President Trump that you are very confident he will hear?
So my message would be, of course, if everything were to break down and we had to, God forbid, resort to some kind of military action, Israel is prepared to do that. And it's clear that President Trump is prepared to give Israel the cover for that. But I implore every single person who has the ability to influence this to keep the negotiations and the deal as it's moving on track. Again, if we could accelerate it, because all the citizens of this region would benefit from an acceleration, then let's accelerate it. But the key is, let's not let the deal fall apart.
John Poland, Rachel Goldberg Poland, thank you again. We mourn with you, and I appreciate your coming on. Anytime you would like to come back, just let me know, and we will make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you
Go
so
with
much.
God. Bless you. I was referring to yesterday, John and Rachel made a statement early in the day, which circulated quite broadly. Everybody out now. Later in the day, Donald Trump said this, cut number one.
Well, I would say this, and I'm going to let that be because that's Israel's decision. But as far as I'm concerned, if all of the hostages aren't returned by Saturday at 12 o'clock, I think it's an appropriate time. I would say cancel it and all bets are off, and let hell break out. I'd say they ought to be returned by 12 o'clock on Saturday, and if they're not returned, all of them, not in drips and drabs, not 2 and 1 and 3 and 4 and 2. Saturday at 12 o'clock, and after that, I would say all hell is going to break out.
Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, said this afternoon, intense fighting will resume in Gaza if hostages, all of them, are not released by Saturday. So there are reports of a number of divisions of the Israeli Defense Forces have mobilized in and around Gaza, that special operators are mobilizing as well, and that indeed all hell is going to break loose if Hamas does not return Israel and the world, its citizens, by Saturday, noon in America, 7 p.m. in Israel, I believe, and I think that is the actual deadline. David Drucker is senior political writer for The Dispatch. David, another slow news day. Donald Trump has sprung Nick Fogel from Russia. Mark Fogel, he's on his way home with Steve Witkoff. Zelensky gave an interview to The Guardian saying he's open to a land swap, giving up the Kursk salient for land that Russia invaded. And of course, we don't have a constitutional crisis, but we got a lot of court suits. What's your overall assessment as we begin week 4?
I mean, more of the same, right? I mean, there's just this administration from the last administration is much more active, but it's also just different, right? And so whenever you go from one party to the next, especially in the very beginning, you're going to see a lot of change. And look, Trump in particular this time around is probably doing what he conceptually or philosophically wanted to do the first time around when he was president before, but didn't really know how to do and didn't have the team around him that was going to affect the sorts of disruptive things he wanted. So, none of this is surprising me. I listened to him on the campaign trail. I believed it, and he's following through.
The most obvious thing I think he's learned is that if you can get someone confirmed to an executive level 1 job, Secretary of State, they can take any other EL job as acting, like Archivist of the United States. So Marco Rubio is both Secretary of State and the Archivist of the United States. And Russ Vought is Director of OMB, and he's the acting director of the Consumer Finance Protection Agency. He's learned some of the tricks. It's sort of like a developer is a learning machine. I think we're going to see a lot more of that, David. Do you?
Yeah, I would suspect so. I mean, obviously, at some point, some of this stuff might run afoul of statute, and if Congress cares to do anything about it, that could cause that could put a little obstacle in the president's way. We're seeing people attempt to use the courts to get in the president's way. That's hardly anything new. This president, the last president, the first Trump presidency, the Obama presidency. But I just think this time around, the president he appears to have a better understanding of what he wants to do and how he wants to do it. And for people that disagree with his agenda, that's going to be quite frustrating. For people who support his agenda, that's going to be heartening.
Now, David Drucker, last night, Caitlin Collins on CNN, and Brian Stelter reposted it, said, some are saying we are dangerously close to a constitutional crisis. Well, some people are saying anything at any time. That's just dumb. It's ridiculous, actually. And I just talked about it with Noah Rothman. The editor's podcast at National Review is devoted. We haven't had a constitutional crisis, a real one, since the Civil War. The court packing plan that FDR proposed in 1937 would have been a constitutional crisis had it passed, because it would overturn the rule of law. But I mean, really, shouldn't we just stop this? It's just a bunch of lawsuits about what can and cannot be done. No one's denying the right of the court to review or failing to conform behavior to court rulings.
Yeah, listen, look, I would say, and I've talked to voters about this, I've talked to people in Washington about this. There are some people that believe that we're in a sort of brewing constitutional crisis. As I often tell people, wait for something to happen before you determine that something is a crisis. I do think it's fair to say that the Trump administration, that President Trump, is stretching the bounds of executive authority even more than his predecessors did, meaning he's hardly the first president to stretch the bounds of executive authority. Presidents love their authority, as opposed to Congress, who seems to want nothing to do with their authority. He seems to be stretching it more than his predecessors. The judicial branch is happy to stretch its bounds of authority as well, and it is responding to President Trump by doing some of that. The judiciary has never been shy about stretching the bounds of its authority. It's where the term activist courts comes from. If you're on the left, you think the right's been activist and vice versa. I don't think we're in the midst of some full-blown crisis, and I've told people again, wait for one to happen before you call it that.
And we're not going to have one. Donald Trump has never defied a court order. He showed up in the New York courtroom and sat there through a kangaroo court for I don't know how many days. David, let's turn to what might be a world crisis, not a constitutional crisis, but a world crisis. On Saturday, 7 p.m. in Israel, noon American time, if I understand the president right, all hell's going to break loose unless 76 hostages or their bodies are returned. What do you think is going to happen?
I have no idea, but clearly the president seems to have established some sort of what we like to refer to in these situations as a red line. And so either Hamas is going to not test him, or they're going to test him. I do think it's curious. The president was responsible through his envoy Witkoff, working in the last days of the Biden administration with a deal where you had people released a little at a time. And then he he messed up his own deal by declaring he wanted to move the Palestinians out of Gaza, not let them return ever. The U.S. would take control of Gaza. All of this has been very nebulous. It's caused tensions in the region with our own allies. But if they were going to do this deal and have Israel release hundreds of prisoners per every Israeli or American returned, they should have just not done any of that and said, release them all or else. Because now what you have a situation where you have hundreds of terrorists back out on the streets, so to speak, and the deal's going to fall apart. And even if the deal doesn't fall apart completely, if you could have done this or else thing, you should have just done it from the beginning.
Well, I don't know whether it was option. I think Trump is reacting, as Trump does, to the visuals. Some people learn by reading. Some people learn by dialogue like Bill Clinton. Other people are impacted by images more than anything. Nelson Rockefeller, Donald Trump come to mind. The images of those three hostages obviously struck the president as beyond the pale, sort of like the Syrian children being gassed in his first term. I think all hell's
Well,
going to
yeah,
break loose on Saturday.
I understand that, but I mean, this has been beyond the pale from the beginning. And so sometimes the president gets a little over his skis and undermines his own goals. And I think, this might be one of those instances. I mean, his Middle East policy overall is an improvement from the previous administration and has been one of the areas in which he was strong, even in the first term when he was still sort of figuring out the contours of the job. I'm just saying, if this is how it was going to go down, either let the deal, come to its conclusion and then move on to the next step afterward, or don't bother at all, and you still have hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian terrorists still in jail.
David M. Drucker, always good to hear from you, writing for The Dispatch. You're a senior political writer. We appreciate your joining us. One of our great sponsors, andrewandtodd.com. Andrewandtodd.com, lend you money to buy a house. And today, I'm looking at the 10 years down just a tick, but it doesn't really matter. When you're buying a 30-year mortgage, when you're buying a house and you're using a 30-year mortgage, you put down however much you can put down, and Andrew and Todd walk you through what the best amount to put down is, what the minimum is. They'll give you a pre-qualification letter. You can compete, whether it's a hot market or a slow market, wherever the market is. You can go in with a letter in your hand that says, this individual is well qualified to buy this amount based upon their income, and we will lend them. You're pre-qualified. They are lenders. They're with Sierra Pacific Mortgage. You can call Andrew and Todd at 888-888-1172. I'm talking about it now because I want the entire country to hear. From Maine to Southern California, from Seattle, Washington, down to Florida, andrewandtodd.com is where you go to get the best mortgage deal available on the national market. They lend everywhere. And they do multiple family homes, they do investment homes, they do second homes, but mostly their sweet spot, helping you buy the house you want to build your family and your life in. So if you call them at 888-888-1172, you're going to deal with pros. Sierra Pacific Mortgage has been the same company. They haven't changed their name for the 25 years I've been on the air. They've never changed their name to my knowledge. And that's because it's the same basic blocking and tackling that you have to do. Due diligence on the loan, get the docs in order, get the loan underwritten and approved. They are the lender. There's no middleman. They're trying to give you the best rate they possibly can, and they do. They've done my loan when I moved back to the Beltway. They did Dwayne's loan when he refinanced. And here's the kicker. It's the good thing. Right now, rates are higher than they were 3 years ago, 4 years ago, because of Joe Biden. Donald Trump is going to work to get those rates back down again. It's going to take a while. If you do your loan with andrewandtodd.com, 888-888-1172, they will automatically put you into the file to refinance whenever it makes sense for you to refinance. So take it from me, a customer. Take it from the thousands of listeners to the Hugh Hewitt Show, andrewandtodd.com. Now, I do want to play for you Tom Homan on Fox with Sean Hannity last night talking about leaks about ICE rates, cut number 11.
Are Tom Homan. Tom, where are these leaks coming from?
Well, look, we think it's coming from inside, and we know the first leak of Aurora is under current investigation. We think we identified that person under investigation right now. The California leak, Secretary Noem, she's correct. Some of the information we're receiving tends to lead toward the FBI. But I talked to the Deputy Attorney General all this weekend. They've opened up a criminal investigation, and they have promised that not only this person lose their job and lose their pension, they're going to go to jail. They're going to criminally prosecute. So
I want, you know why? This is dangerous stuff. The ICE agents and their detailees from other law enforcement agencies are going into very dangerous situations. If you leak that they are coming, you can get them killed. And there have been hand grenades rolled through doors, automatic weapons fire. It's all documented. It's all real. And so I'm very glad to hear that the Department of Justice is going to prosecute anybody who leaks knowledge of an ICE raid. Bret Baier is the anchor of Fox News special report every night at 6 p.m. in the East. Bret also sat down with President Trump for his first of what I hope are 4 Super Bowl interviews at Mar-a-Lago before flying off to the Super Bowl. Bret Baier joins me now. Hello, Bret. How are you?
Hey, Hugh. Doing well.
Did you book next year's Super Bowl already with the president?
It's not our game, so hopefully it'll be somebody else's interview. But I thought, it was an example of why President Biden should have done those interviews. We had one, obviously, where he turned down, and he turned down one with CBS as well. But President Trump obviously wanted to do it, and we flew down to Mar-a-Lago to do it.
I enjoyed it, Brett. And I got to say, then you went to the Super Bowl. I asked Dwayne to ask you that. Did you understand the halftime show? I'm reading about the secret messages in Lamar's halftime show, but I didn't understand it at all. Did you?
No, not
Okay.
at all. I was in the stadium and I didn't understand anything. So
let's go back to
but
the president.
My kids did.
Oh,
My
they
kids,
did?
Explained it to me,
Oh,
and the whole Drake thing and all of that. But no, it didn't work for me. But I guess it worked for some.
okay. I want to go back to the interview. You've interviewed President Trump many, many times. What was different about this time?
Well, first of all, I've said to you before, I think he's comfortable in his skin, and he knows what he wants. It's tough, and you know this. You've had him on the show many times. He does that thing, the weave, and he goes from one thing to another, and you got to get him back on the topic that you asked about. But he did make some significant news in that interview. He kind of deepened his explanation about what his vision is for Gaza,
Yes.
which he talked about again today with the King of Jordan. He talked about Ukraine and having some kind of equity deal with rare earth minerals, and the fact that essentially he thinks that they're going to get to the table. And this comes today, as Zelensky says, he's ready to give Russia some territory back, and Russia releases this American prisoner, Vogel. And, we could be seeing the beginning of what looks like a negotiating table being set up.
Now, earlier today, in the first hour of the program, Brett, I interviewed John and Rachel Goldberg-Polin. Their son, Hirsch, of course, murdered by Hamas in late August. And yesterday, John Polin said, release all the hostages right away. And today, they didn't walk it back, but they urged that the process not break down after Donald Trump basically echoed John's remarks yesterday and gave an ultimatum. I don't think he's backing away from that ultimatum. What do you think?
I don't think so either. And Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu gave a speech shortly thereafter saying essentially the same thing and positioning Israeli defense forces on the outskirts of Gaza, prepared to deal and release the ceasefire if that deadline's not met. So it was backed up by the Israelis on the ground, and the president said it again today.
Are you staying close to your studio noon Saturday?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I really do think the war is going to resume. Do you think that it's possible the United States would strike at Iran?
No.
Okay.
I think also in that news of that interview was that his wish about Iran is that that they do not get to that point, and he senses, he at least forecasts that there's a deal in the making, and a deal in the making with Iran, a deal in the making with Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, as far as what the future holds for Gaza, a deal in the making with China on tariffs and negotiations on TikTok. I mean, he is very bullish on all of the deal-making possibilities, but we'll see what comes to pass.
Some of our friends and competitors on other networks are declaring a constitutional crisis, and I think that's ridiculous. But what do you think, Brett?
I agree. I mean, listen, some of these Democrats were the same Democrats that urged President Biden to ignore the courts when it came to student loans, to ignore the courts when it came to mandates on vaccines. And look, I just don't think that district judges where, these prosecutors go to, and sometimes they're judge shopping specific places in Rhode Island, and Delaware, and New York, that they can oversee the executive branch on this DOGE issue and federal spending. Congress has the power of the purse. They are saying they are in to this effort to try to find waste, fraud, and abuse. And, I think it will come to a head probably at the Supreme Court, but these individual judges with freezes, I'm not sure have the power of the executive the president who was elected by the American people.
Yeah, you are frequently talking with Andrew McCarthy, and I think he is the equal of any legal analyst out there, but there are a lot of bad ones as well. Let me wrap up this way, Brett. I've asked you this before, but I like to go back to it. You've been doing this a long time. I've been doing this a lot. I have never seen this pace of news. It's just literally every hour. So that you tape an interview at Mar-a-Lago, it makes news on Sunday, it makes news on Monday, but then the news completely changes. And yesterday's news is no longer today's news. How long can this go on for?
I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, the pace is fast and furious. It doesn't seem like President Trump is stopping that pace, and he kind of likes this pace. I do think that they had a number of things built in with executive orders over the first few weeks, but in the shock and awe of changing the government. But I don't know if this pace can continue for all 4 years.
Well, Brett, I appreciate your joining us. Congratulations. Great interview. Great ratings. My gosh, the ratings were off the 123 million or something like that.
127.7 million.
That is, and thank you for Tubi. Whoever's in charge of Tubi, because I, of course, again, couldn't make my YouTube TV work because I'm on the West Coast. And so I was back into Tubi. Thank God Fox had that available for people. It wasn't much of a game, though. Was that the worst Super Bowl you've ever seen?
Yeah, the crazy part is it's the most watched. So, I mean, 24-0 at halftime. I thought for sure the numbers would go down, but they didn't. And, at the highest, it was about 138 million people watching.
Yeah. Wait till the Browns get there. It's going to be wild. Brett Baird, thank you. As always. Let me check the markets for everyone because it's a crazy time if you're in business. I mean, a really crazy time. And every day, AmericanFederal.com, a sponsor of our show, brings you the market report. American Federal is the buyer and seller of gold. And if you're a coin collector, yes, they'll do that with you too. Nick Grovich loves coins. He's been doing it since he was a kid. He's been operating gold and silver sales, straight up sales, since for 44 years. 1-800-221-7694. 1-800-221-7694. The Dow Jones up 0.3, the S&P up 0.09, NASDAQ down 0.22. Pretty boring day today. Gold is at $2,930 an ounce. It's down a tick. But again, that number, $2,930 an ounce. We had to switch safety deposit box. A branch of our bank was closing, so we had to go and take everything out and put everything. And the fetching Mrs. Hewitt did that. I said, try not to get followed when you go from bank one to bank two, because that's where our gold is, and it's going to be in there. And don't leave it at home. Don't leave it around. But when you buy gold, you forget about it. You buy and you forget about it. It's part of your diverse portfolio. So what you want to do is call up Nick Grovich or one of his team at 800-221-7694 or go to AmericanFederal.com. Whatever is the price of gold, they add their commission to it if you're buying. Whatever is the price of gold, they subtract your commission, their commission from the amount of gold that you ask them to appraise, value, and buy. So you're not getting 100% one way or the other. You got to pay people who are in the middle. And it's all very upfront. That's why I really worked Nick Grovich to become a sponsor of the show, because for years he was with Dennis. He's still with Dennis. And I heard him. I sat down with him, went over and sat with him at his office, and just loved the guy's transparency. And in this day and age, all you want is a straight up transaction. The markets can be very funny. Gold has more than kept pace with inflation for the past 100 years. That could change. You never know. I doubt it. But I don't make financial recommendations. I just recommend that if you're going to buy or sell gold or silver, do it with Nick Grovich at AmericanFederal.com. John Kennedy, one of my favorite senators, yesterday on the Senate floor, cut number 9.
What else? I'm not going to spend my whole time talking about this, but nobody else is talking about it. They're just talking about the process and Mr. Musk, and he's a mean guy, and he shouldn't be looking at our spending. Well, he is. And I kind of find what he's found out interesting. He found that we gave $2 million, USAID did, for sex changes in Guatemala.
All right, now I have trouble figuring out which one he was going to lead with, because John Kennedy's a trial lawyer and he knows how to lead with the best punch. So he went with the $2 million for sex changes in Guatemala. And you know what? There isn't an American out there, or at least there are very, very few, who think that was a good expenditure of your tax dollars. Longtime friend of mine, William Bennett, Dr. William Bennett, former Secretary of Education, former head of the National Endowment for the Humanities, former drug czar, and still a friend of this show and of everyone who cares about serious thinking. Of course, the author of the Book of Virtues and many other books. Dr. Bennett, welcome back. How are you, and how is Mrs. Bennett?
Hello, Hugh. Mrs. Bennett is fine. I remember your recommendation for her to run for the Senate in North Carolina.
She should be Senator Bennett right now if anyone listened to me, but no one did. But
Okay,
she's
that's right.
probably
That's
happy
right.
in North Carolina. Bill was my predecessor in the morning slot that now Chris DeGaulle has taken over. And we agree that's a slot that's reserved for men of middle age or women of middle age. Bill, what I wanted to ask you straight up, what should we expect can be done at the Department of Education, which you helmed, by DOJ or by Linda McMahon or by a combination of that and the reconciliation bill? What can actually be accomplished?
That's a very good question. I think a lot, actually. Couple of functions I'd like to keep. The NAEP, you know what the NAEP is, the National
don't.
Assessment of Educational
Oh,
Progress.
okay, yes.
That's the scores when we hear about math and reading. It is the single best test in America. It is the most reliable test in America. A lot of people don't like to take it because often the results are what we've had recently, but keep that one. Keep a few other things. Let me tell you some targets for DOJ and others. The single biggest target, this is interesting, Hugh, is the higher education loans, student loans, which of course you know about Joe Biden trying to do this. But over time, it has come to close to a $2 billion deficit in terms of not paying them back. It's now at 1.7 billion. Well, why can't we just send that back to the private sector? A lot of it should go back to the private sector. But you want to know how funny the government is? 1.7 trillion in unpaid student loans is listed as an asset.
Huh?
Okay. Got it? Because of the
Is it 1.7
fiction.
trillion, Secretary Bennett? 1.7 with a T, trillion? Okay.
With a T, which is close to the whole amount that DOJ is supposed to save, right?
Gosh.
Okay, they can't get it all. They can't get it all there because it's complicated. But the government lists it as an asset. That's the first complication. So, but what they need to do is to dig deep at Treasury, using Treasury to find out, what's really going on with these loans. Who's not paying them? Who's paying them? My guess is the government has good loans of the 1.7 trillion of about, let's say, a trillion, 900 billion or a trillion. The rest are not. They're never going to be paid. So what to do about that? You see, it's a complicated thing. It'll take.
Well,
Treasury
I
people.
want to ask you a question there. There are whole law firms which take bad debts and buy them for a dime on the dollar and then do their best to collect them. Can that asset that is overvalued at 1.7 trillion be sold off to the private sector for collection?
A lot of it can be, yes, and should be, yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Go back to the side. Well, let's go to the federal spending on state education next. Can that be block granted?
Yes, a lot of it can be and should be. And in fact, when I was secretary a few years back, I asked the recipients of federal largesse what was the single best program. You know what they said? The block grant program. Well, sure, that's because they have discretion, but they're likely to do in 50 different ways much better than the government has done, particularly if you look at the agenda of this last crowd, which was all the things we're reading about when we hear about wokeness, et cetera. So I think that's a great asset. A lot of money in something called social and emotional learning, and that's been a great mischief pot. That's where you've had a lot of this stuff on, gender fluidity and things like that. But social and emotional learning could be a real thing. You could tell kids that they should learn to read at an early age. They have to, and use the best available methods for doing that. And instead of having them learn about, critical race theory and gender fluidity, they could learn what the virtues are. How about that, Hugh?
I have a textbook. I have a textbook to
Okay, yeah,
recommend.
okay. They don't have to use my book, but it's not a bad place to start. But there are other sources as well. Yeah, you can block grant a lot of it, and there are programs that you can eliminate. And I'm happy to talk to Linda McMahon about that if she wants.
Now, Secretary, I always say this when Senator Cotton is on, so I'm going to say it to you as well. You went to Harvard Law School, so I'm unfamiliar with how well you acquainted with the Constitution you are, because that's sort of an optional deal at Harvard Law School. But you know the spending clause allows the Congress to attach conditions to money. Do you
Right.
recommend in this reconciliation budget process that they condition Department of Education funds to the states on those states adopting some sort of school choice, at least as robust as, say, Arizona's or Florida's or Ohio's?
Yes, absolutely. And that's not all. You make a great point because if you send it back to the states and block grant and say it's your decision, your discretion, I said the 50 together will make a better pie than the single baker, the federal government deciding. But what about a huge state like California? And Gavin Newsom, were they going to do the right thing? No. You've got to condition the block grant reception by all states that they do school choice. They allow for school choice, vigorous school choice, such as what you've described. In addition to school choice, accountability. That is, they have to report how their students are doing, at least in math and reading. School choice is good. It's the beginning. It's a necessary, but as we say, not a sufficient condition of doing the right thing.
All right, Secretary, I don't know how big Department of Ed was when you ran it, but it's got 4,400 employees now. Of those 4,400, how many of are critical, and what do you think of the authority of DOGE and or Secretary McMahon to lay off, furlough, or otherwise retire those 4,400 people?
Well, a lot of them can be retired, and if you block grant, as we have described, a lot of the programs, most of the programs, and again, I'm back to the student loan. That the student loan is the fat boy in the canoe. I mean, it's half the
Wow.
budget probably. I haven't looked lately. Do you know what the budget is for the Department of Ed? Have you noticed
No.
lately? I was just going to look it up. Someone told me it's 90 billion. Do you know it was 13 billion when I was there?
Good Lord.
That was a few years ago, but good grief.
1988 is not that long ago. That's a ridiculous
Right.
increase.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So the
Stand by.
answer
I'm
to
going
your
to come right
question is
back.
a
I'm going
lot.
to continue talking to Bill Bennett. I taped the interview a little bit earlier today. I do want to tell you, however, about the Job Creators Network, our friends. Since we're talking about education, school choice, let me tell you about educationfreedomusa.com. Bill Bennett should get involved in educationfreedomusa.com by Job Creators Network. They're pushing for school choice everywhere. Educationfreedomusa.com. Alfredo Ortiz and the gang at Job Creators Network are incredible spokespeople for freedom. They are incredible spokespeople for economic growth, and they know that we need an educated. I'm going to talk to Bill about this when we come back. We can't have these scores. We really cannot have these scores. We have to get people to read. We have to get people into schools that work, and that's educationfreedomusa.com. Job Creators Network is our sponsor. I'm always glad to have them as a sponsor. This is one of their initiatives near and dear to my heart because we've got to save America's kids. They're not learning even how to read. Talking with former Secretary of Education Bill Bennett right before the show began. Let's return to that interview.
But until you dig in, and those kind of, I like DIGE too, dig. You don't know how many of those folks.
It
But
is
with block
68
grants, you
billion.
obviously save money. Huh?
It's $68 billion.
Okay, well,
I'm a little still astonished that we have $1.7 trillion in student debt listed as an asset, and we must have 1,000 people trying to collect that, or maybe not doing their job and not collecting it. That's a revelation. How about the Office of Civil Rights? There is an Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education that was MIA in the last 17 months as anti-Semitism ran rampant on America's campuses. Can it be saved? Can it be reinvigorated? Can those lawyers be fired and replaced with real lawyers?
I think you want the federal civil rights ability in those cases, which are egregious, where people have good claims, and yes, they can be aggressive when you have something like what we've seen on these campuses, as you've described. I've talked about a lot as well. Yeah, but it actually doesn't have to be at the Department of Education, does it? It could be at the Justice Department, and it could be smaller at the Justice Department, because the Justice Department knows how to do this already. So yes, that's a lateral move that could save you some money.
All right, now, Dr. Ben, I want to go backwards in time to when you ran the NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities. That money strikes me as very similar to USAID money. A grant was made to NEH by the Congress, and then it re-granted the money according to the competition. I was a general counsel of it after you left, so I know that system a little bit. Do you think that's what's comparable to happening at AID, and do you think it's within the authority of now Secretary Rubio, who's acting director of USAID, or whoever's going to run NEH, to just reprogram all that money?
Yeah, you could. Look, as I said at the Department of Education when I was there, we did better before there was a Department of Education. And I think the humanities were certainly better before NEH. We tried to put it on the right track, and substitute good programs for bad programs, because abolition of NEH was not something that Ronald Reagan wanted to do. You know why he didn't want to do it?
No.
Because it's the twin agency of the National Endowment for the Arts. And you can imagine who was on the National Endowment for the Arts, lots of the Reagan crowd. But I did get to have dinner with Frank Sinatra.
Well, see, there are benefits. President Trump has fired everyone over at the Kennedy Center. This is off on a frolicking detour. You have nothing to do with the Kennedy Center, as far as I know. Maybe Elaine Bennett was on the Kennedy Center.
She should be.
I think this is great. If they put normal people who with some experience on that board, it would actually make sense. I wouldn't have fired David Rubenstein, though. I mean, is it too much of an axe? Is it too much of an axe?
No, you can bring people back. I agree with you. I like David Rubenstein. I mean, I think he's done a lot of good work. He has saved a lot of important things from the founders. And I don't think he has a political identity, although I'm sure someone told President Trump that, the Biden stayed with the Rubensteins on their vacation. I'm sure he would have been happy to be in the Trump Tower as well at some point, or Mar-a-Lago, I guess I should say now, right? Yeah, the answer is yeah. You can do that. I was thrilled when I read that. I just laughed because we have been going to Kennedy Center events, and some of them, we just walked out on, and some of them were great. We saw Les Miserables there. It was great. And then we go and see something, and it's all about offending people like me and you.
It's actually just bad. It's just bad. Especially Mrs. Hewitt and I walked out with my mom and dad. It's so long ago. My mom and dad were alive. They came to town when we were working the Reagan years. We went and saw the musical 9. It was the worst music. We just said, we're out of here. It's terrible. They need a new board. But bring back David Rubenstein.
We are 3 weeks into the second Trump presidency, 3 weeks, and tonight there are warnings that the U.S. is dangerously close to a constitutional crisis.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. We are not in a constitutional crisis, but maybe Byron York disagrees. Byron York is a Washington Examiner columnist, lead senior political reporter, Fox News contributor, and level-headed. Did I miss something, Mr. York? Are the rebels at Concord? Are we in a civil war? What's going on?
Well, I have to agree with you on this one. I saw your response on Twitter today to the constitutional crisis line, and I think you're right.
It's ridiculous.
We're certainly not in a constitutional crisis, although I would be a little worried if Judge Engelmeyer was interpreting the Constitution.
There are a lot of bad judges. There are a lot of good judges. There are a lot of decisions which will go one way or the other. The point is, it's just the way it's set up to work. The branches disagree with each other. There are checks and balances. There are courts of appeals. There's Supreme Court. Unless and until Trump says, no, I'm not going to do it, goes full Andrew Jackson. The court has made their order. Now let them enforce it. We're not in a constitutional crisis.
No, we're not. Although, don't you think this gives, now you know much more about this than I do. Don't you think this gives some energy to the move that's been afoot for quite a long time, that a lot of people at very high levels in the legal world and in the government world think, we really shouldn't have a situation where a single federal district judge somewhere can issue a nationwide injunction against, an act of the president.
Yes, it does. In fact, Justice Gorsuch has hinted at this in some of his concurrences. And
so this, I think, gives some momentum to that, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's ridiculous because the idea that an 84-year-old district judge appointed by Reagan dismissed. Now, I happen to disagree with the birthright citizenship executive order, but there's an argument to be made, to be heard, and to be weighed. And this guy threw a tantrum and said this is wildly unconstitutional. It's not wildly unconstitutional. It's never been decided. It's a case of first impression. And so I don't like judges doing that, grandstanding, but we're kind of used to that by now, and it's not a crisis, kind of like theater.
If I could bring up a kind of a specific example, I don't know if you've been talking about this NIH thing, the National Institutes of Health.
No, I have not been.
Indirect. Well, it's another one of these things that has brought a lawsuit and just a lot of hysterical reporting, which is basically NIH gave out last year about $35 billion in grants for medical and science research. Now, of that $35 billion, $26 billion went to direct research, and $9 billion went to administrative costs and overhead, what are called indirect costs. Okay, and so a lot of people have thought for quite a long time that $9 billion is pretty high. It averages indirect costs paid by NIH average between 27-28%, and have gone up in some cases, and we know about them, to 50 and 60%.
I got two questions, Byron. How much went to the Wuhan virology lab?
That's an excellent question, and I don't know the answer.
Okay. Second one, did any of that money go to institutions like Harvard with a $50 billion endowment?
No, but I mean, a lot of them, yes. A lot of them have gone to universities with huge endowments.
And
the universities are charging huge amounts for overhead, for administrative costs, and the NIH is paying it. So, anyway, they're paying average between like 28%, okay? Well, what the crazy men at DOGE did was they looked at, NIH is not the only institution that gives out research dollars in the country. There are lots of private foundations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. There's something called the Gates Foundation as well. There's the Zuckerberg Initiative, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I mean, there's Smith Richardson. There are a lot of them. What do they do about the indirect costs? Well, it turns out they put caps on the amount of indirect costs that the grant recipient can spend. And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is 15%.
Which is
the Robert
reasonable.
Wood Johnson Foundation is 12%. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, 15%. The Smith Richardson Foundation, 10%. So what they did, what these insane, crazy men at DOGE decided was, let's cap NIH indirect cost spending at 15%, at the high end of what private foundations allow, and that will save a lot of money and allow the same sort of research.
Byron, you're getting dangerously close to reporting here. I have not seen those numbers about Smith Richardson, Bill and Melinda Gates Fund. Where did those numbers come from?
They came from NIH. They did along at the same time. The Washington Post and other media outlets began going crazy. NIH handed out this fact sheet that about what the private foundations were spending. Now, so they do this. NIH does this, and the press says the New York Times headline is Trump administration cuts put medical progress at risk, researchers say.
It's so silly.
CNN's headline, researchers decry disastrously bad idea, quote, as NIH slashes payments for research. Now, the Huffington Post just says, Trump sledgehammers NIH funding catastrophic hit to science. And Patty Murray, the senator, comes out and says, Americans are going to pay for this with their lives.
What are they going to do when a meteor comes at us? I really do not know how they're going to up the adjective ante when the meteor.
I don't know. That's a good point. When you've already taken it to 11. I mean, is there a 12? I don't know.
Byron, I got a question for you. I do think we have a crisis coming on Saturday, and
Yeah.
Saturday at noon. That's a real international crisis. Lives are at stake. Hostages are dying. They're being starved to death in Torrey. Is that a crisis? I think that's a crisis.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a constitutional crisis.
Correct.
But certainly it's a crisis for Israel. It's a crisis for the other side. And Donald Trump himself has come out, I think it was yesterday, when he set the Saturday deadline. You know, all these hostages need to be released by Saturday or all hell's going to break loose. Now, you remember that Trump had said that that the Gazans, the Palestinians, had to release all of the prisoners by the time Trump became president, or all hell could break loose. Well, Trump was more patient than that, but I think he can't keep saying this.
Yeah, well, he dialed it back. He dialed it up once he
repercussions.
saw the condition of those. He's a visual man. My interview with Rachel and John is posted over at HughHewitt.com, the transcript. 2 days ago, before Donald Trump said Saturday noon, everyone or hell breaks loose, John said, all the hostages now. And I thought he was right. Today, he and Rachel didn't walk it back, but they made it very obvious they're more concerned with the hostages' lives than anything else, and they don't want the war to resume. I don't think there's, 400 Israelis died in that war in Gaza. The parents of the dead Israeli soldiers don't want Hamas left in power. I think Israel's going back to war on Saturday, and I wonder, do you think we're going to support them in ways we haven't done before, and do you think Iran might be on the target list?
Well, I think they are going to go back to war on Saturday, and you often have this situation in hostage situations in which the government forces believe they have to be tough hostage takers, and of course the relatives of the hostages, if they feel there's any chance their loved ones can be saved, they want the government to hold back. I mean, this is a natural tension, totally understandable. Now, as far as us helping the United States, helping in ways that we hadn't before, I think when Trump became president, pretty much at noon on January 20th, we released some weapons like 2,000-pound bombs to Israel that Biden had been holding back. So I think we've already, in the Trump era, have already helped Israel in ways that weren't being done in the Biden years.
All right, I have two more questions for you. One, let's jam in here quickly. Is the reconciliation thing going to get done or not in the House?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's funny. I was when you called, I'd been writing on a piece all day about the Biden economic hangover, going through all the spending and the inflation and all of the useless stuff. And one of the things that Congress is actually trying to do is maybe claw back some of the money that was just wasted and hasn't even been spent yet from the Inflation Reduction Act. It's hard to get anything done with 217 Republicans in the House. Now, I still don't think that Elise Stefanik has resigned. You and I have talked about this. There's 218 right now, Republicans, 215 Democrats. When Stefanik does resign, it'll be 217 to 215, meaning you
They need
can't
everybody.
lose even one vote.
Byron, there's a shooting star constellation of news stories all over the place. One of the shooting stars that went by so fast, very few people noticed it, is that when asked if J.D. Vance was his successor, Donald Trump said no. I mean, I just said, huh? What is that? Because Ike wouldn't have said no.
I thought that was striking. That was in Bret Baier's interview on Super Bowl Sunday of Trump. And he said no in a rather emphatic way, too.
Well, what do you rate? I didn't ask
it.
Brett about it because they moved on pretty quickly, and I think maybe he was surprised. I talked to Brett earlier today. Were you surprised by that?
Not when I thought about it. I do think it's kind of early to actually declare Vance to be Trump's successor. Now, Brett did ask, if I remember, a follow-up question, which was, okay, you're saying that right now because it's just 3 weeks into the administration, but come midterm time, J.D. Vance will want an endorsement from you, and of course, I think Brett was entirely right about that, but that's not something that Trump really wanted to face. at this particular moment. So, I was a little surprised because I think Vance has turned out to be a spectacularly good choice for Trump. On the other hand, Trump is a man who likes to be in the center of everything. And I mean, he is now in a way that even he could not have imagined.
He wants
He's
to pick
making
the nominee to
everything
succeed him.
go in Washington right now.
Right.
Everything.
He wants to pick his
so
successor.
he's not ready to talk about a successor.
Yeah. And he gets if he won't talk about it until 2028, I think.
Yes. Maybe January 19th, 2029.
Yeah, well, we got to get to the Iowa caucuses in 2028, and I don't think he'll sit them out. It would be very, very unusual. I can't remember what Ike did with RN in 1960. Do you?
Let's see what 19.
Nixon became vice president in 53, ran for president in 1960, was nominated. I think Stassen, but I can't remember anyone else running against him. But I don't know when I should know this. I ran the Nixon Library for twice and should know that, but I don't.
Hadn't Eisenhower declined to endorse Nixon for a while? As a matter of fact, was famously asked about Nixon's accomplishments and said, if you give me a few days,
I remember that. I don't know, though, by the time they got the convention, whether or not he had gotten the full-throated endorsement. Byron York, always a pleasure. Watch him on Fox News, read him in the Washington Examiner. Press on, Byron. This is a shooting gallery of stories that you just pick one and you focus on it every day. Byron's got. I learned stuff today about the overhead rates, and that is reporting. It's occurring on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Normally we just opine. Okay, we just opine. If you wish, by the way, to opine about this show, you've got to like and subscribe it at YouTube, and you can go and see the interview with John and Rachel Goldberg Poland, which is already posted at hughhewitt.com, and Bill Bennett, and everything else. Bus to Guatemala and then cross the Darien Gap in Panama. Maybe I've got it backwards. You're going to pause when you see and you hear Donald Trump saying all this. And one of the arguments I had with Charlie, discussion, not an argument, is there are metrics. It's not unfalsifiable. You just have to wait a year to see what happens because the results in the stats, right? We're going to know how many people crossed illegally. And we're going to know how many fentanyl deaths there are. And if the fentanyl deaths come down significantly, I don't really care what means he used, provided they're illegal. And one of those means is the bully pulpit. I'm kind of happy about this, Rich.
Yes, I think a lot of the messaging was going on even before Trump got elected. The Trump team was not upset about these hysterical headlines in the New York Times. They're going to be camps for illegal immigrants, exactly to the point you're making. They want people south of the border to see that. Now, wait a minute, we really want to deal with that if this guy is elected again? And sure enough, we've seen that deterrent effect instantaneously the way that we did the first time around. Crossings have basically gone to zero. Now you need a lot of cooperation from the Mexicans and other things to happen to keep it at zero. And I think that's what's going on in these tariff negotiations. We need not just 10,000 Mexican troops at the border, that sends a good signal, but the Mexicans to reinstitute remain in Mexico, to police their southern border, to send illegal immigrants that are in their country trying to get across our border, send them out of Mexico entirely instead of just sending them to the south to do this whack-a-mole and come up within Mexico again. And I think there's a pretty good chance we're going to get all of that now that we have Mexico over a barrel with this tariff threat.
I agree. And I think that's what he did, and I think that's what he intended to do. Rich Lowry, great addition of the editors this morning and last week. Keep going at it Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Thanks,
the editors, podcasting, worth your time. Learn something every single time. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. Alex Gray, we are lucky to have, is the CEO of American Global Strategies. He served as chief of staff of the National Security Council under President Trump in the first term. In fact, he spent all 4 years in the White House during President Trump's first term, but he's at American Global Strategies now. Alex, today, two things happened. Ukrainian President Zelensky proposed to the Guardian newspaper in Great Britain that a swap of land was possible, giving up the salient that they have in Russia and for Russian invaded territory in Ukraine. And then Vladimir Putin released an American prisoner held for 3 years, flying home, I think, on Mr. Witkoff's plane now. What do those two things have to do with each other, if anything?
Well, thanks again for having me, Hugh. They're deeply related in my view. I think we've always known that the salient was established to gain negotiating leverage, to have something to bargain at the table. And we all know this is going to get resolved at the negotiating table. There's no solution here to end this conflict that's not ultimately diplomatic. But ultimately, it's going to be resolved by a correlation of forces on the battlefield at any given time, and by the type of diplomacy that the United States can put together to get enough leverage to make trades that benefit all parties and create enough incentive for them to make tough deals. I think part of the hostage situation, getting Mr. Fogel out, it was long overdue. This is something that President Biden had multiple opportunities to include in deals. He didn't do it. President Trump gets it done in 3 weeks. I think this is a huge win for America, and it's a huge opportunity to continue to grow our leverage. I think for General Kellogg, the special envoy, to have another chit at the negotiating table, along with the salient, along with some sanctions relief, to get a deal done.
Now, I don't expect to hear anything from General Kellogg publicly, or from Michael Waltz, the new National Security Advisor, or from Secretary of State Rubio or Pete Hegseth. Do you? Well, you were there. You know how the NSC works in national security matters, where they don't announce these things in advance, do they?
Generally not. Look, I don't think Michael Waltz is going to do anything publicly. I think he's adopted a similar model, what we call the Scowcroft model, similar to my old boss, Ambassador O'Brien, which is the National Security Advisor, serves as an honest broker and tries to get all the senior principals on one page, doesn't showboat, doesn't run around giving speeches all the time. So I think that's the model Mr. Waltz has adopted. Look, I think the president's going to lead this. I mean, we both know, Hugh, the president is the most hands-on negotiator in the American presidency, probably since Theodore Roosevelt. And he's going to be the one who ultimately sets the public tone for what these negotiations look like. I think, everyone who works for him, from the senior cabinet principals down to the lowest Schedule C, know they're all supporting characters. And the president, that's how he wants it. And I think that's how these negotiations are going to play out.
Hey, Alex, I want to change directions. There has been a bill introduced in the Senate, Lindsey Graham, to up defense spending by $150 billion. That's a lot. The House is allegedly working on a budget resolution that will be introduced sometime this week, I believe, also with a huge defense increase. At the end of the day, no matter what else is in this package, do you anticipate a huge increase in defense spending on the part of the Trump administration?
I think ultimately, Hugh, we're going to get some increase. I don't know how much. I would like it to be substantial. I know Senator Wicker and Senator Graham, Senator Cotton want to see something substantial. I know a good chunk of House Republicans do as well. Obviously, there are factions within the party that have a different view of defense spending, and their voices are growing. And particularly in the House, in a very narrow majority, they're going to have disproportionate say at the moment. But look, I think what matters, Hugh, is that we get some increase now. We get an increase that allows the Pentagon to be able to make investments over the long term to rectify what I think is the fundamental national security challenge we face, which is that the military balance in the Indo-Pacific between the U.S. and China is fundamentally moving in China's direction, because we have neglected for over a decade to make, I would say actually closer to 2 decades, to make the long-term investments we need to make to have that long-term advantage. And so if we can start building a series of budgets that grow even incrementally the top line, that's what we need to do to get back on track for a longer-term military advantage and for deterrence.
Do you agree with other guests I've had on this week that we have to start with under the water, both the Columbia-class replacement of the Ohio-class ballistic submarines and with Virginia attack submarines at a pace quicker than 1.5 every 2 years, which is what we are right now?
Hugh, we should have been building 3 Virginia-class a year for the last 10 years. And the fact that we can't is a testament, I think, 1, to some significant industrial-based challenges, and 2, to some questions of priority that we need to sort out at the national level. Obviously, the Columbia replacement is extraordinarily expensive. It takes a lot of resources away from other priorities. But yes, undersea is critical. It's been an American advantage since World War II. It's an advantage in the Indo-Pacific that we have to maintain. But we can't lose sight of other things as well, right? We have to have the long-range strike bomber, the B-21. We have to have a number of different programs that are precision strike, that are projection forces, that are what we need to have the type of deterrence that's going to keep the peace in the Indo-Pacific.
Now, Alex, Admiral Montgomery was on yesterday, United States Navy Vice Admiral, retired, over at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. I'm sure you know Mark. And he took a deep breath, and he said, yeah, the Army's going to have to shrink. Do you agree?
Look, I think the Army probably is going to have to shrink in some ways, but at the same time, we have to be strategic, and we have to be thoughtful about how we do it. The Army has a role in the Indo-Pacific. The Army is going to play a key role in controlling some of the islands in the second and third island chain in the Pacific Islands, where I've spent a lot of time. That's going to be a critical part for the Army. The Army is going to have to build its own anti-access area denial network that boxes the Chinese into their end of the island chain. I mean, the Army can use anti-ship cruise missiles. The Army can use kind of going back to the old coastal artillery model of the early 20th century, but with updated weaponry. The Army can be really essential in that region, but it's got to look like the Army of the future, not like the Army of 1990.
Last question, Alex Gray. Who's going to build our Iron Dome?
That's a tough question. I mean, look, we need to build an Iron Dome. We need a missile defense system that's capable of protecting this hemisphere. And Hugh, I would be remiss in not using this as an opportunity to say, with everything going on with our Canadian friends, we have tremendous vulnerabilities in North America that are caused by, I would argue, in large extent, the fact that our Canadian friends have not been ponying up to provide for the joint defense of the airspace in North America. We have to make real investments, and we need to have allied support to make sure that we can defend our continent, our homeland. We have to get that done, both missile defense, but also just securing the basic airspace above our cities. That's something the Canadians can't even get a fighter. They can't even do combat air patrols as required by NORAD to help secure our joint continent.
Wow.
That's a disgrace. And we need to be able, that's what spending 1.3% of GDP on defense generously calculated, that's what that gets you. And that's a huge problem.
Alex Gray, CEO of American Global Strategies, former Chief of Staff, National Security Council. Thank you for joining me. Breaking news, Donald Trump in the executive office, Oval Office, issuing another executive order with Elon Musk and little X, Elon Musk's younger son, cut number 13.
And we thought that we would not let him do that segment or look in that area if we thought there was a lack of transparency or a conflict of interest. And we watched that also. He's a big businessman. He's a successful guy. That's why we want him doing this. We don't want an unsuccessful guy doing this.
That's pretty smart. Cut number 16.
Billions and billions of dollars in waste, fraud, and abuse. And I think it's very important. And that's one of the reasons I got elected. I say we're going to do that. Nobody had any idea it was that bad, that sick, and that corrupt. And it seems hard to believe that judges want to try and stop us from looking for corruption, especially when we found hundreds of millions of dollars worth, much more than that, in just a short period of time. We want to weed out the corruption. And it seems hard to believe that a judge could say, we don't want you to do that. Well, so maybe we have to look at the judges, because that's a very serious, I think it's a very serious violation.
Now, he did say he would comply with, and always has complied with, orders from the judiciary. By look at the judges, I think he means look at the list of new judges, maybe add some judges. Cut number 17.
For the sake of the country, I hope that the person that's in charge and the other people that report to me that are in charge are allowed to do the right thing, namely make sure everything's honest, legitimate, and competent. But we're looking at just, when you look at USAID, that's one. We're going to look at the military. We're going to look at education. They're much bigger areas. But the USAID is really corrupt. I'll tell you, it's corrupt. It's incompetent, and it's really corrupt. And I can't imagine a judge saying, well, it may be corrupt, but you don't have the right. You got elected to look over the country and to, as we say, make America great again, but you don't have the right to go and look and see whether or not things are right that they're paying or that things are honest that they're paying. And nobody can even believe this. Other people, law professors, they've been saying, how can you take that person's right away? You're supposed to be running the country, but we're not allowed.
Andy McCarthy isn't a law professor, but he's a 20-year special. There are lots of old school law professors who read the Constitution and say Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. They're going to mix it up, and it's all going to be fine. But the Article 2 is the executive branch. The president is the head of the executive branch. The president gets control and gets to look for and root out corruption and bad spending. Elon Musk weighed in, cut number 15.
So at a high level, if you say what is the goal of Doge and I think a significant part of the presidency is to restore democracy. This may seem like, well, are we in a democracy? Well, if you don't have a feedback loop, FAX, we would have to, if you sorry. So I tell you, gravitas can be difficult sometimes.
If you're watching on the Salem News Channel, you bring a 3-year-old in to anything gravitas. Do you remember when Chief Justice Roberts was announced by W as his pick for the Chief Justiceship, and they brought his young son in? I think it's John Jr., who was age 4. Same thing. You bring a 3 or a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, gravitas can be difficult. And I wouldn't have it any other way. Kind of fun. Good to see kids. J.D. Vance arrived in Paris today. The vice president arrived with the second lady and their 3 children. They came down they're young, right? They're not even, I think they're probably 2, 5, and 6. They're not 9 and 10 and 15 and they're not like Barron Trump when Barron was in the first term. They're not 12. And so Barron is now, he's an adult. But when you got little kids are going to do little kid things and Band-Aids and stuff like that. That's good. But I want to make my larger point. Article 1 is the legislative branch. Article 2 is the executive. Article 3 is the judiciary. The head of the executive branch is the President of the United States. Causes and controversies can go to the court to be resolved at the district court level. Then they can be appealed to the circuit court level. And then the disappointed party, plaintiff or defendant, can seek certiorari from the Supreme Court, which may or may not grant it, not original jurisdiction. And it's all up to them to do what they want to do. It's really just up to them. Lilacs is in the house from the very Minnesota cold. James, I was cheered to see you spill your coffee on the computer board last week. I can't hear him. We can't hear him. Yeah, that's weird.
You can hear me now.
I can hear you now. So
okay,
are you going to spill it?
I spilled coffee in my computer last week, and so it shorts out from time to time. You were saying?
Yes, I was saying I was reassured by that. So now I know you're normal. I want to test a proposition with you. I've been a customer of Fidelity for 30 years with 6 accounts, 2 of which are significant, 1 of which is not insignificant, 3 of which were insignificant. So they send me a letter that begins, Dear Fidelity Investor, we are writing in an attempt to contact you about state unclaimed property laws that could have a significant impact on your Fidelity account. The U.S. Post Office has returned mail to the address referenced above. Your state unclaimed property laws require that accounts with returned mail be coded as abandoned. How would you react to such a letter?
Well, I would regard it as completely above board and legitimate. I would send them all of my financial information completely and then wonder exactly why Fidelity was operating out of Lagos, Nigeria. But yeah, I trust it. What would I do, Hugh? I would grab that money, for heaven's sakes. For a while there, I had a check that apparently had been unclaimed. News to me. Somebody did a search for my name, told me about it, and then after a few hoops of jumping through, ta-da, money. So, yeah, you might want to look into that.
Well, I did. I called them. I spent 90 minutes on the phone in a fruitful attempt to close 2 of the 4 accounts, 2 of which were beyond my ability to do because they're Uniform Gift Act, a minor account. Here is the check I received yesterday for one of the accounts.
I see.
So after their commission, they liquidated an account. They didn't tell me that in the letter. Don't you think that would have been a useful thing to know?
It would have been useful information, pertinent information. But I think I speak on behalf of all of us when we like the idea of Hugh Hewitt working for an hour and a half for 11 cents. You know, because we know the level of compensation at your stratospheric point in this enterprise. So you worked for 90 minutes and you got a dime and a penny. And that penny, by the way, hold on to it, because if Trump stops making pennies, then I don't know. I'm thinking pennies are going to be pretty valuable in the future.
You know, I've never received a check for 11 cents before. I'm not going to cash it. What do you think they're going to do if I don't cash it?
They will come after you again and again. Spy Magazine a few years ago did a test where they sent a bunch of checks in inconsequential amounts like that, and only to famous people. And I think only Warren Buffett and Donald Trump were the ones that cashed the checks for 11 and 13 cents. And they made fun of them for that. But I said, no, that's why these guys have the money.
That's
because
right.
They don't put in the drawer a check. I mean, I would take it to the bank. I would get it in cash. I would look at that 11 cents and say, what can I get for this boon, this gift from heaven that I did not expect?
Pennies from heaven. All right, now I changed completely. Yesterday, Bill Maher did a rant, or the weekend, about the fact he used to be able to watch 2 channels and watch 2 football games and switch back and forth, and now he can't do that.
Right.
Tom Hanks did a rant a couple of years ago about all he wants is his TV to work with him. I couldn't get YouTube TV to work for me this week. I had to watch the Super Bowl on Tubi, whatever Tubi is, the free streaming service, because I couldn't otherwise watch it. Are you completely baffled by the new set of instructions that come with Roku TVs?
No, none of the above. My wife, however, is different. Let me give an example. There's this one show that she loves because it's full of time-traveling, handsome men who go about and do things in Scotland or whatever. I can't tell you. Outlander, Headlander, Biglander, I don't know. She wants it. It's on Stars. Great. I get an offer from Tubi. No. From Hulu. No. From Fubu. No. From Toga. Whoever I get my television from, saying that for about $1 a month, they will give me this channel. She can watch her show. And I say, that's fantastic. So I get it for her. But here's the problem. On the Apple TV, where all of the apps are located, there's an app for Stars. Stars is what she wants. So when she goes to it, it's not good. It's not valid. What's the password she wants to know? And I have to tell her, no, hon, we don't get Stars through the Apple TV pane. We get Stars from the Hulu pane up here. So you have to navigate, go down, and then go all the way down to find it, at which point, of course, she wants to go to discuss it.
That is my experience pretty much every night.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
it's ridiculously complex, and it's exactly the world we wanted.
Will there be one ring to bind them all and in the darkness find them? Is that coming someday?
Yes. Progress, where you just pay one guy one thing with one set that's got 500 channels, and then we go through it and say, why am I paying for 400 channels I don't watch? Why couldn't I get them separately? Hugh, this is the world we wanted, and now that we got it, big surprise, we find it comes with its own complications.
I know one of the new appointees in Team Trump, younger man, and I gave him 2 pieces of advice. Don't hire any friends. Don't take any favors from anyone. Then I added a 3rd piece of, that's number 1. Don't hire anyone you know. Number 2, don't, under no circumstances, accept any favors. Not dinner, not staying on somebody's couch. Don't do any of that stuff. You got to pay your own way, even if it's a pain in the neck and it's your best man from your wedding. You still can't sleep on their couch. Number 3, do not hire anyone who can't work the remote control. What do you think about number 3?
Mm-hmm. I think number 3 is excellent. And by that, I don't mean just a little Apple control, which has 2 buttons and practically is idiot-proof. I mean those big, massive things that's got 47 buttons with a special button for Netflix that doesn't work, with an input button that your parents hit and they don't know what they did, and you actually have to fly across the country to show them, no, you don't hit the input, you want to go to this. Yes, somebody should be able to take up any remote ever made by any circumstance and be able to figure it out within seconds, because that is an agile.
I have one more complaint.
And I include this.
I have one more complaint. The new Roku TV does not have a pause button on it. Have you ever heard of that?
I don't exactly know, and I'm probably thinking that there is one, Hugh, then you haven't found it yet.
Have
you tried turning it off and turning it on again?
I've turned it on and off 1,000 times. I must tell you, if it's there, I'm going to have to hire a consultant to come find it. Lilacs, you are techno adaptable, are you not?
Yeah, I'd like to think so.
And so is this a passing problem, or is it one that is going to swallow the entire continent?
It shows absolutely no signs of getting better in any sense. Everything is getting more complex in our ability to comprehend it. As the boomers age, you see a new industry rising to help them navigate things like remote controls on a Roku. Trust me, there. It's 2 little lines. It's got to be there.
It's not there, I swear. It's like my Fidelity check, 11 cents worth. James Lilacs, find him at Lilacs. Listen to the Diners podcast. Get his Substack. It's all at lilacs.com.
We are 3 weeks into the second Trump presidency, 3 weeks, and tonight there are warnings that the U.S. is dangerously close to a constitutional crisis.
Bellissimo, I think aliens are invading. I think we are dangerously close to being invaded by aliens. Can you please report that on Dwayne's World?
I may be too busy with all the breaking news that's going to happen in the next 2 hours.
Well, I just think if we're dangerously close to an alien invasion, you've heard a report. You ought to go out there. I said it.
Well, okay, fine. Caitlin Collins is not.
She's reading a prompter.
She's reading a prompter.
And somebody put that in the prompter who doesn't know anything about constitutional law.
By the way, you know your pause problem on the Roku?
What? What is it?
Your check that had 11 cents on it. The 2 ones. That's what the pause button looks like. Lilacs wanted me to let you know that. In case you needed help, what a pause button is.
The 11-cent check. I think he had the best answer. The audience is probably happy that I spent 90 minutes to get an 11-cent check. They didn't tell me how much was in the account.
You're not exactly working your way into the Doge team.
No, I'm not. I'm not gonna praise you for losing 50 pounds on my PhD weight loss now. That's my PhD weight loss, 864-644-1900.
That's 864-644-1900.
Do you think we're laughing? You're in the car. You can't see it. We have a picture of my 11-cent checkup that I got from Fidelity today.
Yes.
90 minutes to get that check.
Yes.
They didn't tell me.
To get the Twin Towers of Fidelity.
You know, Dwayne's World is pretty funny.
You know, it can be.
It can be.
Yes.
My PhD weightloss.com is not funny. It's not deadly serious, but it's easy. And it works.
It works. And you'll be in a much better mood when you can move about a lot easier and do things that you couldn't do for a long time.
And I was thinking that after the Super Bowl blowout that some people had,
yes,
nachos and cheese, maybe a few beers,
yep,
perhaps a couple of pizzas, and some. What else would people have eaten on Super Bowl day?
There's tons of chips, dips,
everything.
Yes,
it's like the anti-my PhD weight loss.
Correct.
Day.
It's like carb day. Yes.
And so Brett Baer told us earlier that 132 million people watched that.
Yep.
So what do we think is the audience among that 132 million people for myPhDweightloss.com?
Ones that could probably take off the 10 they just put on over the weekend, about 130.
About 100%.
Yeah.
I'd bet my entire check on that.
I bet you do.
864-644-1900. I want to thank Adam. I want to thank Harley. I want to thank Dwayne. It was a wild show, and we began on a very serious note with John and Rachel Goldberg-Pollen, and we ending up on a lighthearted note, and in between we covered everything that happened today, almost. But for the rest of it, you're going to have to go to Dwayne's World, because I don't have enough time to play all of Elon's stuff or all of Donald Trump's stuff. I didn't play any of King Abdullah. All that stuff is going to be on Dwayne's World. When are you laying that down?
Laying that down at about 6:30 East Coast time, 7:30 East Coast time.
Dwayne.world?
Dwayne.world. It'll pop up tomorrow with Jim Talent. You think Jim Talent might find something to talk about in all the foreign policy news?
Would you get his opinion on my 11-cent check?
Sure.
Okay, great.